The boy who chose duty over comfort. Before you close your eyes tonight, imagine standing on a quiet hill just before sunrise. The world is still asleep. The wind carries the scent of pine trees, and the distant sound of a bugle echoes through the valley. Somewhere beyond those mountains, a young army officer is about to make a decision that will change countless lives forever. This is not a story about war alone. It is a story about loyalty, sacrifice, friendship, and the quiet courage that often goes unseen. So settle in, breathe slowly, and let this story carry you through the night. In the small farming town of Ashbrook, where mornings arrived with golden sunlight stretching across endless fields, a boy named Daniel Carter grew up believing that honor was worth more than wealth. His father repaired old tractors for neighbors. His mother taught children at the local elementary school. They never had much money, but their home was always filled with kindness. Every evening, Daniel's father would sit on the wooden porch after dinner. The old man had served in the army many years earlier. He rarely spoke about battles. Instead, he spoke about people. The greatest soldiers, he often said, are remembered not because they defeated an enemy, but because they never abandoned a friend. Daniel never forgot those words. While other children dreamed about expensive cars or becoming famous athletes, Daniel dreamed of wearing the nation's uniform. Not because he wanted medals. Not because he wanted glory. Because he wanted to protect people who could not protect themselves. At 12 years old, Daniel witnessed something that shaped the rest of his life. A violent storm swept through Ashbrook. Rain poured without mercy. The nearby river overflowed. Families rushed to higher ground. An elderly couple became trapped inside their farmhouse as floodwaters rose around them. Most people stood helplessly, unsure what to do. Then several National Guard soldiers arrived. Without hesitation, they tied ropes around their waists and entered the rushing water. One soldier slipped. Another grabbed him. Together they reached the farmhouse. Minutes later they emerged carrying the frightened couple safely to shore. Daniel watched every second. He didn't see fearless superheroes. He saw ordinary people choosing courage. That night, he told his parents, "One day I want to help people like they did." His mother smiled through tears. His father simply nodded. "I know." Years passed. Daniel studied harder than anyone else in school. He woke before sunrise. He ran through muddy roads every morning. He practiced discipline while his friends slept late during weekends. People laughed. "You work too hard. Enjoy being young. You'll change your mind." Daniel never argued. He simply smiled. Some dreams don't need defending. They only need commitment. At 18, Daniel earned acceptance into one of the country's most respected military academies. The first day was nothing like he imagined. The instructors shouted. The physical training seemed impossible. Every muscle burned. Blisters covered his feet. Sleep became a luxury. Some cadets quit during the first week. Others disappeared before the first month ended. Daniel considered leaving only once. Late one rainy evening, after nearly 16 hours of training, he sat alone outside the barracks. His hands trembled from exhaustion. He stared at the ground. Maybe everyone had been right. Maybe he wasn't strong enough. Just then, an older instructor quietly approached. Instead of yelling, the man sat beside him. "You miss home?" Daniel nodded. "You think this is impossible?" Another nod. The instructor smiled. "Good." Daniel looked confused. "If you thought becoming an officer was easy, you'd never understand the responsibility that comes with it." The instructor stood. "Go get some sleep. Tomorrow begins another opportunity." Those words stayed with Daniel for years. The academy wasn't only about strength. It was about trust. Cadets learned that one careless mistake could endanger an entire team. During obstacle courses, the fastest students often slowed down to help those who struggled. The strongest carried extra equipment for weaker classmates. Nobody graduated alone. Everyone depended on each other. Daniel discovered that leadership had very little to do with giving orders. Real leadership meant serving others first. One winter training exercise changed everything. A snowstorm arrived unexpectedly. Visibility disappeared. Temperatures dropped below freezing. The cadets became separated across rugged terrain. Daniel heard someone calling for help. Following the voice through deep snow, he found another cadet whose ankle had been badly injured. Returning to camp together meant moving painfully slowly. Daniel had a choice. Leave his friend temporarily and reach safety faster. Or stay. He never considered leaving. For nearly 4 hours, Daniel supported the injured cadet through waist-deep snow. By the time rescue teams found them, Daniel could barely stand. Both young men survived. Later that evening, the academy commander addressed every cadet. "You have witnessed something important today." He pointed toward Daniel. "Strength fades. Talent comes and goes. But character." He paused. "Character is what remains when nobody is watching." The room fell silent. Daniel felt embarrassed by the attention. In his mind, he had simply done what anyone should have done. That quiet humility earned him respect far greater than any award. Graduation arrived beneath clear blue skies. Families filled the parade field. Rows of young officers stood proudly in freshly pressed uniforms. Daniel searched the crowd until he saw his parents. His father wore the same old smile. His mother wiped away happy tears. As Daniel received his commission, his father saluted. Daniel returned the salute. Neither spoke. Neither needed to. Both understood what that moment meant. One generation was passing its values to the next. A week later, Second Lieutenant Daniel Carter reported for his first assignment. The base buzzed with activity. Helicopters thundered overhead. Vehicles rolled across dusty roads. Experienced soldiers moved confidently through their daily routines. Daniel suddenly realized something. For years, he had prepared to become an officer. Now he actually had to lead. Real people. Real families. Real lives. The weight of that responsibility settled quietly upon his shoulders. His commanding officer greeted him with a firm handshake. "Welcome, Lieutenant. I've heard excellent things about you." Daniel smiled politely. "I hope to earn those words every day." The commander nodded. "That's exactly the answer I hope to hear." Daniel had no idea that within a few short years, he would face the greatest test of his life, a choice between his own future and the lives of the soldiers who trusted him. And when that day came, the decision he made would become a story remembered long after the echoes of battle had faded. But that chapter had not yet begun. For now, the young officer stood beneath the morning sky, believing that courage meant running toward danger. Soon, he would learn that the greatest courage often lies in the quiet choices no one else ever. The Army officer who gave up everything for his men. Part 2, the platoon that became a family. The first morning at his new duty station arrived long before sunrise. A cool breeze drifted across the parade ground as Lieutenant Daniel Carter adjusted the collar of his uniform and walked toward the headquarters building. The base was already awake. Trucks rumbled down narrow roads, mechanics prepared vehicles for training, and somewhere in the distance, a bugle announced the beginning of another day. Daniel paused for just a moment. This was no longer a classroom. No instructor would grade his decisions. No textbook could tell him exactly what to do. From this day forward, every choice he made would affect the lives of real soldiers. That responsibility weighed more than the pack he carried through every academy exercise. His commanding officer greeted him with a firm handshake. "Welcome to Bravo Company, Lieutenant. I've heard excellent things about you." Daniel smiled. "I hope to earn those words every day." The commander nodded. "You've been assigned 2nd Platoon." He slid a folder across the desk. 36 soldiers. Different ages. Different backgrounds. Different personalities. They don't need a perfect officer. They need an honest one. Daniel tucked the folder under his arm. "I understand, sir." An hour later he stood before his platoon for the first time. Some soldiers looked curious. Others looked skeptical. A few had clearly served much longer than their new lieutenant had worn the uniform. Daniel knew exactly what many of them were thinking. He's too young. Too inexperienced. Can he really lead us? He could have delivered a long speech. Instead, he simply introduced himself. "My name is Daniel Carter. I don't expect your respect on the first day. I'll earn it. I'll work as hard as anyone here. And I'll never ask you to do something I wouldn't do myself." The formation remained silent. But several experienced soldiers exchanged quiet glances. It wasn't a remarkable speech. It didn't need to be. It sounded genuine. Among the platoon was Sergeant Michael Hayes, a veteran with nearly 20 years of service. Calm, patient, highly respected. His hair had begun turning gray, but no one questioned his ability. That afternoon he approached Daniel. "Lieutenant, walk with me." Together they crossed the training grounds. Michael pointed toward soldiers cleaning equipment. "See them?" Daniel nodded. "They'll notice everything. They'll notice whether you arrive early. They'll notice whether you admit mistakes. They'll notice whether you listen. They'll notice how you treat the newest private." Daniel listened carefully. Michael continued. "They won't remember every order you give, but they'll remember how you made them feel." Daniel smiled. "I appreciate the advice." Michael returned the smile. "Good officers keep learning. Great officers never stop." The following weeks passed quickly. Daniel refused to stay inside the office when training began. He ran beside his soldiers, carried equipment alongside them, shared meals in the dining facility, helped clean vehicles after long exercises. When rain soaked everyone's uniforms, his became just as wet. When the summer heat became unbearable, he never complained. Slowly, the platoon's doubts disappeared. Not because Daniel demanded loyalty, because he demonstrated it. One evening, after a difficult field exercise, several soldiers gathered around a small campfire. Stories drifted through the cool night air. Some spoke about childhood. Others laughed about embarrassing mistakes made during training. Daniel mostly listened. He learned that every soldier carried invisible burdens. One worried about a sick mother. Another missed the birth of his daughter because of deployment. One quietly admitted he feared disappointing his family more than facing danger. In that moment, Daniel understood something important. Uniforms made everyone look alike. But beneath every uniform lived a unique story. Leadership meant understanding those stories. Months passed. Bravo Company became one of the strongest units on the base. Not because they were the fastest. Not because they were the strongest. Because they trusted one another. Trust cannot be ordered. It must be earned. Every shared hardship added another brick to that foundation. Late one autumn afternoon, an unexpected training emergency tested the platoon. A military transport truck lost control while descending a steep gravel road. The vehicle rolled onto its side. Several soldiers became trapped. Daniel arrived seconds later. Without hesitation, he organized rescue efforts. Medical teams were called. Equipment was secured. One by one, the injured soldiers were safely removed. Throughout the chaos, Daniel never raised his voice. He remained calm, focused, steady. Afterward, a young private approached him. "Sir, I was scared." Daniel nodded. "So was I." The soldier looked surprised. "You were?" Daniel smiled gently. "Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what's right despite it." The private never forgot those words. Neither did Daniel. That winter the platoon spent weeks training deep in the mountains. Snow covered everything. The nights were bitterly cold. Simple tasks became exhausting. One evening a fierce blizzard arrived much sooner than forecast. Visibility dropped almost to zero. Radio communication became unreliable. Several teams became separated across the rugged terrain. Daniel immediately organized search groups. Every minute mattered. Hours passed. The temperature continued falling. Finally, one missing team was found sheltering beneath rocky cliffs. Cold, exhausted, but alive. As everyone returned safely to camp, Sergeant Hayes quietly looked toward Daniel. "You made the right call." Daniel shook his head. "We all did." Hayes smiled. "That's why they follow you." Spring arrived with new orders. Bravo Company would soon begin preparations for an overseas deployment. No details were shared. Only that the assignment would be demanding. Families gathered during a weekend picnic before the intense training cycle began. Children laughed while chasing footballs across open grass. Spouses shared homemade food. Parents hugged sons and daughters wearing military uniforms. Daniel walked quietly among them. He realized something many civilians rarely considered. Every deployment involved far more than soldiers. Entire families served in their own way. They waited. They worried. They hoped. They counted every day until their loved ones returned home. Looking around, Daniel silently promised himself one thing. If these soldiers trusted him with their lives, then he would do everything within his power to bring them back safely. It was a promise no officer could guarantee, but it was one he intended to honor with every decision he made. Weeks later, the official briefing finally arrived. Bravo Company assembled inside a large operations building. Maps covered the walls. Intelligence officers stood quietly near a projector. The room felt different. No one joked. No one whispered. The commanding officer entered carrying a sealed folder. He looked slowly across the room before speaking. Men and women, our country is called. In 30 days, you deploy. Silence filled the room. Some soldiers lowered their eyes. Others thought immediately of their families. Daniel felt his heartbeat quicken. Everything he had trained for. Every lesson his father had taught him. Every sacrifice made at the academy had led to this moment. He looked toward Sergeant Hayes. The veteran simply nodded once. No words were necessary. Both men understood. Their greatest test was no longer approaching. It had begun. The weight of responsibility. 30 days passed more quickly than anyone expected. The final week disappeared beneath paperwork, inspections, equipment checks, and quiet conversations that no one wanted to end. Every soldier packed far more than uniforms and supplies. They packed photographs. Letters from children. Wedding rings worn smooth by time. Tiny reminders of the lives waiting back home. Lieutenant Daniel Carter walked through the barracks one final evening before departure. Some soldiers laughed over card games. Others called their families. One private sat alone, carefully folding a picture of his newborn daughter into the inside pocket of his jacket. Daniel stopped beside him. Beautiful little girl. The young father smiled proudly. She was born 3 weeks ago, sir. You'll meet her soon enough, Daniel replied. I hope so. Daniel placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Give yourself every reason to believe that day will come. The young soldier nodded, holding on to those words. The transport aircraft lifted into the night sky just after midnight. Inside, conversation gradually faded. The steady hum of the engines filled the cabin. Some soldiers slept. Some stared silently through the tiny windows. Others closed their eyes, thinking of home. Daniel carried a small notebook in his backpack. His father had given it to him years earlier. Inside the first page were 6 handwritten words. Lead with courage. Lead with compassion. He read them again, then quietly closed the notebook. Their destination was far from home. The landscape was dry and rugged, surrounded by distant mountains that glowed gold beneath the morning sun. The base they joined was already home to hundreds of service members working alongside humanitarian organizations and local emergency teams. Their mission was clear: protect aid convoys, assist with evacuations, help communities recover after months of instability, support civilians whenever possible. Daniel appreciated the purpose immediately. Helping people had always been the reason he chose this profession. Within days, the platoon settled into a routine. Every morning began before sunrise. Equipment inspections, planning meetings, route briefings, medical checks, long hours, little sleep. Despite the demanding schedule, Daniel insisted on eating meals with his platoon whenever possible. Leadership, he believed, happened during ordinary moments, around a shared table, during long walks, through quiet conversations. One afternoon, Sergeant Hayes found Daniel studying maps inside the operations center. You've memorized every road. Daniel smiled. I'm trying. Hayes chuckled. The roads matter, but people matter more. Daniel looked up. What do you mean? The maps will tell you where to go. The people will tell you why it matters. Daniel never forgot that lesson. A week later, the platoon escorted several trucks carrying food, water, blankets, and medical supplies to a remote mountain village. The roads were narrow and damaged from recent storms. Progress was slow. As they approached the village, children ran toward the convoy waving enthusiastically. Elderly residents smiled with relief. Doctors immediately began treating patients. Volunteers distributed food. Daniel helped unload boxes alongside his soldiers. One elderly man approached him. His English was limited, but his gratitude required very few words. He placed a weathered hand over his heart, then pointed toward the children receiving clean drinking water. Daniel smiled warmly. Moments like these reminded everyone why service mattered. That evening, after returning to base, Daniel wrote a letter home. He described the mountains, the brilliant stars, The kindness of strangers. He didn't mention exhaustion. He didn't mention worry. He knew his parents would read between the lines anyway. Before sealing the envelope, he added one final sentence. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Weeks passed. The platoon earned a reputation for professionalism and compassion. Whenever local families needed assistance, Daniel encouraged his soldiers to help however they could. Repairing damaged roofs, delivering medical supplies, clearing fallen trees after storms, teaching children simple English phrases. Small acts build trust. Trust built hope. One rainy evening, the Emergency Operations Center received an urgent report. A powerful landslide had struck a mountain community. Several families were trapped. Roads were blocked. Weather conditions continued to worsen. Rescue teams were requested immediately. Daniel's platoon was assigned to assist. The convoy departed before dawn. Rain hammered the windshields. Mud covered the winding roads. Progress became painfully slow. Several times heavy equipment had to clear fallen rocks before vehicles could continue. When they finally reached the village, the devastation was heartbreaking. Homes had been damaged. Trees lay across narrow streets. Families searched desperately for missing relatives. Without hesitation, the platoon spread throughout the community. Medical personnel treated the injured. Engineers stabilized damaged structures. Daniel organized search teams with local volunteers. Hour after hour, they worked through rain and exhaustion. Late that afternoon, a faint cry echoed from beneath the remains of a collapsed building. Everyone froze. The sound came again. Very softly. Daniel knelt beside the rubble. "Someone's alive!" Rescuers carefully removed broken beams by hand. Minutes felt like hours. Finally, a small opening appeared. Inside was a frightened young girl clutching her little brother. Both were cold. Both were terrified. Both were alive. As the children were gently lifted to safety, the entire rescue team erupted into relieved applause. Their mother rushed forward, tears streaming down her face. She embraced her children so tightly that none of them wanted to let go. Daniel quietly stepped back. This moment belonged to the family, not to him. Sergeant Hayes noticed. "You never stay in the spotlight." Daniel smiled. "The rescue is what matters." That night, the platoon returned to base exhausted. Mud covered every uniform. Hands were scratched. Boots were soaked. Yet morale had never been higher. Not because the day had been easy. Because they had made a difference. As darkness settled over the camp, Daniel looked toward the mountains. He understood something his father had tried to teach him years before. Service wasn't measured only in moments of great heroism. Sometimes it was measured in the quiet relief on a mother's face, the smile of a child pulled safely from danger, or the trust shared between people who had been strangers only hours before. Those were the victories no medal could fully capture. And although Daniel didn't yet know it, an even greater test of his character was drawing near, one that would require every lesson he had learned about courage, compassion, and responsibility. When that day arrived, his soldiers would discover why true leaders always place others before themselves. The rain continued through the night. Soft drops tapped against the roof of the operations center, while Lieutenant Daniel Carter sat quietly at his desk. Around him, the base had finally settled into silence. Most of the soldiers were asleep after nearly 18 hours of rescue work, but Daniel couldn't bring himself to rest. He unfolded the small notebook his father had given him years earlier. The familiar words greeted him once again. Lead with courage. Lead with compassion. He smiled to himself. Those words had guided him through every difficult decision so far. He hoped they would continue to do so. Just before dawn, the emergency radio sounded again. Another powerful storm had swept across nearby mountain communities overnight. Several villages had been cut off after rivers overflowed their banks. Bridges had been damaged, roads were buried beneath mud, and communication with local emergency teams had become unreliable. The request was simple. People needed help. Daniel's platoon prepared immediately. Vehicles were loaded with food, clean water, blankets, medical supplies, and rescue equipment. As engines started, Sergeant Michael Hayes walked beside Daniel. "You know this won't be easy." Daniel nodded. "It never is." Hayes smiled. "That's why we're going." The journey into the mountains was painfully slow. Every mile revealed another obstacle. Trees blocked narrow roads. Small landslides forced engineers to clear safe paths. Several times the convoy stopped completely while local workers repaired damaged crossings. No one complained. Everyone understood that somewhere ahead, families were waiting. Late that afternoon, the convoy reached the first village. The damage was heartbreaking. Homes stood half submerged in muddy water. Farm animals wandered frightened through empty fields. Children clung tightly to their parents. Many elderly residents had spent the previous night inside a small community center, hoping the rising water would not reach them. The moment the trucks arrived, volunteers rushed forward. Boxes of food disappeared into grateful hands. Medical teams began examining patients. Engineers inspected damaged buildings. Daniel moved quietly from family to family, asking what they needed most. The answers were almost always the same. Clean water, medicine, hope. Near sunset, an elderly woman approached him carrying a faded photograph. She pointed to the picture. It showed a young man wearing an old military uniform. Through a translator, she explained that he had been her son. He had spent his life helping others. Years earlier, he had passed away after a serious illness. Before he died, he told her something she never forgot. "When you see someone wearing a uniform, remember there is also a family waiting for them." Daniel looked at the photograph carefully. Then at the woman. He gently placed his hand over his heart. "I'll remember." She smiled. Sometimes gratitude required no common language. For the next several days, the platoon worked alongside local emergency crews from sunrise until well after dark. They cleared fallen trees, helped repair damaged school buildings, distributed supplies to isolated families, set up temporary shelters, played games with children while doctors treated patients. Each small act reminded Daniel why service mattered. Not because it earned recognition, because it restored hope. One afternoon, while inspecting a narrow mountain road, Daniel noticed several local volunteers struggling to move heavy supplies by hand. Without hesitation, he removed his jacket and joined them. Soon other soldiers followed. Within an hour, hundreds of boxes had reached a temporary clinic serving dozens of families. Watching from nearby, Sergeant Hayes quietly smiled. One of the younger soldiers asked him why. Hayes answered softly, "People follow examples. They always have." That evening the platoon gathered outside their temporary camp. The mountains glowed beneath a sky filled with countless stars. Someone brewed coffee over a small camping stove. Another soldier quietly played an old acoustic guitar. For the first time in weeks, everyone relaxed. Daniel looked around the circle. Every face reflected exhaustion. Every face also reflected determination. These were no longer just the soldiers assigned to his platoon. They had become a family. Families looked after one another. Families shared burdens. Families celebrated even the smallest victories. The following morning brought unexpected news. A convoy carrying additional medical supplies had become stranded several miles away after heavy rain damaged another section of road. Without those supplies, several remote clinics would soon run out of essential medicine. Daniel studied the maps carefully. There were two possible routes. One was shorter but badly damaged. The other required many additional hours of travel through difficult terrain. He gathered his senior leaders. "What matters most?" One young officer immediately answered. "Speed." Sergeant Hayes waited before speaking. "People." The room became quiet. Daniel nodded. "If we rush and lose vehicles along the way, no one receives anything. We'll take the longer route." Some worried the decision would delay deliveries. But Daniel trusted patience over unnecessary risk. The convoy reached every clinic safely later that evening. The doctors greeted them with relieved smiles. Sometimes, the wisest decision was the one that attracted the least attention. Weeks gradually turned into months. The region slowly recovered. Schools reopened. Markets welcomed customers once again. Children laughed in streets that had once been silent after the storms. One afternoon, the little girl Daniel had helped rescue from the collapsed building weeks earlier approached him carrying a small drawing. She handed it to him shyly. The picture showed a group of people holding hands beneath a bright sun. At the center stood someone wearing a simple military uniform. Above the drawing were carefully written words. "Thank you for helping us smile again." Daniel felt his eyes fill with tears. He folded the drawing carefully and placed it inside the same notebook that held his father's advice. It would remain there for the rest of his life. Not every lesson came during moments of celebration. One evening, after another long day, Daniel sat beside Sergeant Hayes overlooking the valley below. Neither spoke for several minutes. Finally, Hayes broke the silence. When I was a young sergeant, I believed leadership meant always having the right answers. Daniel listened. It doesn't. What does it mean then? Daniel asked. Hayes smiled gently. It means caring enough to keep asking the right questions. Daniel looked toward the quiet lights scattered across the valley. He understood. No officer could solve every problem. No leader could remove every hardship. But every leader could choose kindness. Every single day. As the deployment entered its final weeks, the platoon prepared to return home. There were inventories to complete, equipment to inspect, reports to finish. Yet everyone knew the hardest part would not be packing their bags. It would be saying goodbye. Goodbye to the children who waved every morning. Goodbye to the volunteers who had become close friends. Goodbye to communities that had slowly rebuilt not only their homes, but also their hope. On the final evening, village leaders gathered to thank the entire platoon. No grand ceremony was held. No speeches lasted very long. Instead, families shared homemade meals. Children laughed. Old friends embraced. The stars appeared once more above the mountains. Daniel looked around quietly. He realized something profound. The greatest legacy of a leader is rarely found in awards, promotions, or public recognition. It is found in the lives made better because they chose compassion when compassion was needed most. The mountains that had watched over the platoon for so many months were wrapped in a gentle blanket of mist. The temporary camp, once filled with constant activity, was slowly being packed away. Vehicles stood ready. Equipment had been carefully loaded. Every checklist had been completed. Yet no one seemed eager to leave. The place had changed them. Not because it had been easy, but because it had reminded them why they had chosen a life of service. Daniel Carter stood alone for a few moments, looking across the valley one final time. The same village that had once struggled through floods and uncertainty now echoed with children's laughter. Farmers had returned to their fields. The schoolhouse had reopened. Fresh paint-covered walls that had once been damaged. Life was moving forward. And somehow, seeing that brought Daniel more satisfaction than any award ever could. As the convoy prepared to leave, families from the surrounding villages gathered along the roadside. Some carried handmade signs. Others simply waved. Children ran beside the vehicles for as long as they could. The little girl whose drawing Daniel had kept in his notebook stepped forward holding a small bouquet of wildflowers. She handed it to him with a shy smile. "Thank you," she whispered. Daniel accepted the flowers carefully. "No," he replied softly. "Thank you for reminding us why kindness matters." The convoy slowly disappeared down the mountain road. No one spoke for several miles. Sometimes silence carried more meaning than words. The flight home felt different from the flight that had brought them there. Months earlier, everyone had wondered what awaited them. Now they carried memories that would stay with them forever. Some soldiers slept deeply. Others quietly looked through photographs stored on their phones. Daniel opened his notebook. The drawing from the little girl rested safely between its pages. Beside it were his father's familiar words. "Lead with courage. Lead with compassion." He smiled. Perhaps leadership was not measured by the number of people who followed you. Perhaps it was measured by the number of people who felt safer because you were there. When the aircraft finally landed back home, cheers erupted inside the cabin. Families waited beyond the turmoil. Children held colorful signs. Parents wiped away tears before their loved ones could see. Spouses searched the crowd, hoping to recognize familiar faces. Daniel stepped through the doors. For a brief second, the world seemed to stand still. His mother was the first to reach him. She embraced him tightly without saying a word. His father followed a moment later. The old mechanic looked at his son with quiet pride. "You came home." Daniel smiled. "I did." His father nodded. "That's all your mother prayed for every day." Daniel hugged them both. For the first time in months, he felt completely at peace. Life soon returned to its familiar rhythm. Morning physical training. Planning meetings. Administrative work. Training new soldiers. The excitement of returning home slowly faded, replaced once again by daily responsibilities. Yet something inside Daniel had changed. He listened more carefully. He smiled more often. He understood that every ordinary day was a gift. Several weeks later, Sergeant Michael Hayes invited Daniel to dinner. His home was simple and welcoming. Family photographs covered nearly every wall. Children's drawings decorated the refrigerator. Hayes' wife greeted Daniel warmly, while their grandchildren filled the house with laughter. As dinner ended, Hayes handed Daniel an old wooden box. "I've carried this through almost my entire career." Daniel opened it carefully. Inside lay faded photographs, letters, old service ribbons, a worn compass, and a small pocket watch. "My first platoon gave me that watch when I became a sergeant," Hayes explained. "I thought leadership meant always being strong." He smiled. "I eventually learned that leadership also means allowing people to see your humanity." Daniel examined the pocket watch. Its hands had stopped years earlier. "It doesn't work anymore." Hayes laughed softly. "No, but it reminds me that time is limited. So spend it on people." Daniel closed the box carefully. Another lesson. Another reminder. Months passed. Daniel continued earning the trust of everyone around him. New recruits admired his calm leadership. Experienced soldiers respected his willingness to listen. Commanders noticed the strong morale within his platoon. One afternoon, he received unexpected news. He had been recommended for promotion. Friends congratulated him. His parents celebrated. Sergeant Hayes simply smiled. "You earned it." Daniel accepted the congratulations with humility. The promotion brought new responsibilities. Larger decisions. More people depending on him. Greater expectations. He welcomed them all. Not because he sought higher rank. Because every promotion offered another opportunity to serve. Despite his busy schedule, Daniel never forgot the people who had shaped his journey. Every Sunday evening he visited his parents whenever possible. His father still repaired old tractors in the small workshop behind their house. Though age had slowed his hands, his smile remained unchanged. One autumn afternoon, while repairing an old engine together, his father suddenly stopped working. "You know," he said quietly, "I used to think success meant earning respect." Daniel wiped grease from his hands. "What do you think now?" His father looked toward the sunset. "I think success is hearing someone say, 'You made my life better.'" Daniel nodded slowly. Those simple words settled deep within his heart. Winter arrived. Snow covered the fields surrounding Ashbrook. One evening Daniel received a letter from the mountain village overseas. Inside were several photographs. Children standing in front of their repaired school. Families harvesting crops. Doctors working inside the rebuilt clinic. On the final page was a handwritten message. "Hope grows wherever kindness is planted." Daniel carefully placed the letter beside the little girl's drawing inside his notebook. Those pages had become a collection of everything that truly mattered. Not promotions. Not awards. People. Always people. As another year passed, Daniel found himself reflecting more often on the future. He wondered what kind of officer he still hoped to become. Not the most decorated. Not the most famous. Simply the kind whose soldiers knew they would never face hardship alone. He often remembered Sergeant Hayes' words. "People follow examples." So Daniel tried every day to become an example worth following. Sometimes through difficult decisions. Sometimes through small acts of kindness. Sometimes simply by listening. Late one evening, after everyone else had left headquarters, Daniel walked alone across the quiet parade ground. The stars above looked remarkably similar to those he had admired in the distant mountains months earlier. He paused. The world was peaceful. The base was still. A gentle breeze moved through the rows of flags. He realized that life was made up of seasons. There were seasons of learning. Seasons of serving. Seasons of leading. And one day, there would also be a season of letting go. He didn't know when that day would come. He only knew that when it did, he hoped the people who had served beside him would remember not his rank, but his character. For in the end, uniforms are carefully folded away. Titles are eventually passed on. But kindness has a way of living in the hearts of others long after the journey itself has ended. And somewhere beyond the quiet horizon, another chapter of Daniel Carter's story was already beginning, one that would ask him to make the most personal sacrifice of all, not for recognition, but for the people he loved most. One act of kindness. Lieutenant Daniel Carter was no longer the young officer who had arrived at his first assignment with nervous excitement. Experience had softened some of his sharp edges while strengthening the values that mattered most. His soldiers still respected him. His commanders trusted him. But the title Daniel treasured most had nothing to do with the uniform he wore. He had become a husband. And, not long afterward, a father. The first time Daniel held his newborn son, the world seemed to grow perfectly still. The tiny boy wrapped his fingers around Daniel's hand with surprising strength. Daniel laughed quietly. "So you're already teaching me who's in charge?" His wife, Emily, smiled from the hospital bed. I think he already knows. Daniel looked down at his son. At that moment, every promotion he had ever received seemed small compared to the responsibility resting in his arms. Life settled into a beautiful rhythm. Morning began before sunrise. Daniel would quietly prepare breakfast while Emily rested. Before leaving for work, he would tiptoe into his son's room. Sometimes the little boy was still asleep. Sometimes bright blue eyes looked back at him from the crib. Daniel never left without whispering the same words. I love you. I'll see you soon. Children rarely remember those moments. Parents never forget them. As the years passed, Daniel's responsibilities continued to grow. He supervised larger teams, mentored younger officers, helped shape the careers of soldiers who reminded him of himself. Whenever new leaders arrived, Daniel shared the same advice. People won't remember every decision you make. They'll remember how you treated them. Many wrote those words in notebooks. Others carried them only in memory. But everyone understood what he meant. One afternoon, Sergeant Michael Hayes announced his retirement. The news spread quickly through the base. Few people had served longer. Even fewer had earned such universal respect. The farewell ceremony was simple. Exactly the way Hayes wanted it. Afterward, Daniel found him standing alone beneath an old oak tree. You've taught me more than anyone. Hayes smiled. I only reminded you of what you already believed. Daniel looked at his longtime friend. What do I do without your advice? Hayes laughed softly. You already know. Now it's your turn to pass it on. Before leaving, Hayes handed Daniel the old pocket watch once more. This time, it's yours. Daniel accepted it carefully. I'll take good care of it. I know. The years continued their gentle march. Daniel's son, Noah, grew from a curious child into a thoughtful young boy. Every Saturday morning, they walked together through Ashbrook. Sometimes they fished beside the quiet river. Sometimes they helped Daniel's father repair old tractors. Sometimes they simply talked. One afternoon Noah asked, Dad, were you ever scared? Daniel looked toward the water before answering. Many times. You were? Of course. What did you do? Daniel smiled. I remembered that courage isn't about never feeling afraid. It's about choosing kindness and responsibility even when life feels uncertain. Noah nodded thoughtfully. He would remember the conversation for the rest of his life. Not every season was easy. Daniel's father grew older. The once strong mechanic found it harder to spend long hours in the workshop. His hands, which had repaired thousands of engines, now trembled slightly while holding a wrench. One evening, after closing the shop together, his father sat quietly on the porch. I suppose every machine slows down eventually. Daniel smiled. Maybe. But you've never stopped teaching. His father looked at him proudly. I've watched you become the man I hoped you'd be. Daniel swallowed hard. No medal could have meant more. Months later, Daniel received another promotion. With it came greater responsibility and longer hours. One evening he arrived home long after sunset. Noah had fallen asleep waiting for him on the living room couch, still wearing his little baseball cap. A children's book rested on his chest. Daniel carefully carried him upstairs. As he tucked the blanket around him, he realized something painful. His son was growing up, and time moved far more quickly than anyone wished. The next morning, Daniel requested a change to his schedule. He turned down an assignment that would have kept him away from home for many months. Some colleagues were surprised. It might have helped his career. Daniel simply smiled. There will always be another position. There won't always be another chance to watch my son grow up. For the first time, he chose family over promotion. And he never regretted it. Years later, Noah graduated from high school. As families celebrated on the football field, Noah quietly handed his father a folded letter. Daniel opened it. Inside were just a few handwritten lines. Dad, people always ask me who my hero is. They expect me to name someone famous. I tell them my hero is the man who taught me that real strength is kindness. Thank you for always coming home. Daniel could barely finish reading. Emily gently squeezed his hand. Neither of them needed to say anything. Some moments speak for themselves. Soon afterward, Daniel stood once again on the familiar parade ground where he had spent so much of his life. His hair now carried threads of gray. The young soldiers arriving at the base reminded him of his own first day. Nervous, hopeful, determined. He welcomed each one with the same simple promise he had made many years earlier. I'll earn your trust. Those words had guided his entire career. One quiet evening, Daniel visited Sergeant Hayes, now enjoying retirement. The old friend sat on a wooden porch watching the sun disappear beyond the fields. Hayes smiled. You've done well. I've tried. No. Hayes shook his head gently. You've done better than that. You remember the important part. Daniel looked at him curiously. What part? Hayes pointed toward Noah, who was laughing nearby with Daniel's father. Life isn't measured by the ranks you wear. It's measured by the people who smile because you were part of their journey. Daniel followed his gaze. 3 generations. His father. His son. His mentor. At that moment, Daniel realized what his greatest sacrifice had truly been. It wasn't giving up comfort. It wasn't working long hours. It wasn't carrying heavy responsibility. It was choosing, day after day, to place other people's needs alongside his own, his soldiers, his family, his community, while never losing sight of the compassion that made him the leader he was. And as the evening sky slowly filled with stars, Daniel understood that a meaningful life is rarely built through one extraordinary moment. Instead, it is built through thousands of ordinary choices made with honesty, humility, and love. The greatest legacy any person can leave is not found in medals, titles, or applause. It is found in the lives that become brighter because they were fortunate enough to walk beside them for a little while. And though Daniel Carter's journey was not yet over, the foundation of that legacy had already been quietly, faithfully, and beautifully laid. For Colonel Daniel Carter, that realization arrived on a cool autumn morning. The leaves surrounding the military base had begun to turn shades of gold and crimson. The parade ground looked much the same as it had decades earlier, yet everything felt different. The young lieutenant, who had once stepped nervously through the front gate, was gone. In his place stood a seasoned leader whose greatest pride was not the rank on his shoulders, but the people whose lives had crossed his path. Daniel looked at the calendar on his office wall. Only 90 days remained until retirement. For the first time in nearly 40 years of service, he found himself wondering what life would look like without the familiar rhythm of military mornings. The news spread quickly throughout the base. Colonel Carter is retiring. Young soldiers who had trained under him found it difficult to imagine the post without his calm presence. Some remembered their very first day. Others remembered difficult conversations when Daniel had encouraged them not to give up. Many remembered something surprisingly simple. He always knew their names. He remembered birthdays. He asked about their families. He celebrated their successes. And when life became difficult, he quietly reminded them that asking for help was never a sign of weakness. Those small moments became the foundation of his legacy. One afternoon, a young lieutenant knocked on Daniel's office door. Sir, may I ask you something? Of course. Were you always confident? Daniel smiled. Not even close. The young officer looked surprised. You seem fearless. Daniel leaned back in his chair. When I was your age, I worried every day that I wasn't good enough. So what changed? I stopped trying to be impressive. I started trying to be useful. The lieutenant quietly wrote those words in a notebook. Years later, he would repeat them to officers of his own. That was how wisdom traveled. One conversation at a time. As retirement approached, Daniel began clearing old filing cabinets. Hidden inside one drawer was the notebook his father had given him so many years earlier. The cover had become worn with age. The pages had yellowed. Carefully he turned through them. His father's handwritten advice. The drawing from the little girl. The letter from the rebuilt village. Photographs of soldiers laughing during long days of service. A pressed wildflower. Each page represented someone whose life had touched his own. Daniel realized the notebook was not a record of his career. It was a record of kindness. That weekend he drove home to Ashbrook. His father, now well into his 80s, still enjoyed sitting on the old porch every evening. His movements had slowed considerably, but his smile remained exactly the same. Daniel handed him the notebook. I've carried this almost my entire career. His father gently opened the first page. The familiar words were still there. Lead with courage. Lead with compassion. The old man laughed softly. I almost forgot I wrote that. I never did, Daniel replied. His father looked toward the sunset. You know, I used to wonder whether those 6 words would matter. Daniel smiled warmly. They mattered every single day. For a long time neither spoke. Some conversations become more meaningful in silence. Back at the base, preparations for the retirement ceremony quietly continued. Daniel requested only one thing. No grand speeches. No unnecessary attention. I'd rather spend time with the soldiers. That request surprised no one. It sounded exactly like him. Several weeks before the ceremony, Sergeant Michael Hayes paid him an unexpected visit. Though retired for years, Hayes still walked with the same steady confidence Daniel remembered. The two old friends embraced. "I hear they're finally letting you retire," Daniel laughed. "So I've been told." Hayes looked around the familiar office. "You've done something special here. I only tried to help." Hayes shook his head gently. "You helped far more people than you realize." The evening before retirement, Daniel walked alone across the empty parade ground. The stars stretched across the sky exactly as they had on his very first night as a young officer. He could almost hear echoes of old conversations, the nervous laughter of new recruits, the encouragement of Sergeant Hayes, his father's quiet advice, the voices of friends whose paths had long since taken them elsewhere. He stopped at the center of the field, closed his eyes, and whispered a simple thank you. Not for promotions, not for recognition, but for every person who had trusted him along the way. The retirement ceremony arrived beneath a bright blue sky. Families filled rows of chairs. Former soldiers traveled from across the country to attend. Many brought children who had never met the man their parents spoke about so often. The military band played softly as Daniel walked onto the parade ground one final time in uniform. His wife, Emily, smiled proudly. Noah, now a young man, stood beside his grandparents. Daniel's father held a cane in one hand. The other rested over his heart. After the formal traditions concluded, the commanding general stepped forward. Instead of listing awards or accomplishments, he told stories. Stories of compassion. Stories of quiet leadership. Stories of evenings when Daniel stayed long after everyone else had gone home simply to help a struggling young soldier. Stories of letters he had written to families. Stories of encouragement offered when no one else noticed. When the general finished, the audience stood. The applause continued for several minutes. Daniel lowered his head humbly. He had never been comfortable standing in the spotlight. Then something unexpected happened. One by one, former soldiers stepped forward. Some had gray hair. Some now wore business suits instead of uniforms. Others arrived with spouses and children. Each carried a single white rose. Without speaking, they placed the flowers on a nearby table. When the last soldier had finished, more than 100 roses covered its surface. The room remained silent. Finally, one former private spoke. "You taught us that leadership begins with kindness." Another added, "You believed in us before we believed in ourselves." A third smiled through tears. "My daughter is alive today because you encouraged me to leave work early the day she became ill." Daniel had forgotten that moment years ago. The father never had. As the ceremony ended, Daniel removed his uniform jacket for the final time. He folded it carefully. Not with sadness, but with gratitude. A chapter had ended. Another was quietly beginning. Before leaving the parade ground, Daniel turned and offered one final salute to the flag that had watched over his years of service. It was not a salute to a career. It was a salute to every friendship, every lesson, every family, and every act of kindness that had shaped the man he had become. As he walked away beside Emily, Noah, his aging parents, and his lifelong friend Michael Hayes, Daniel felt something he had not expected. Peace. The kind of peace that comes from knowing you gave your best, not because you were perfect, but because you never stopped trying to make life a little brighter for those around you. And although retirement had officially begun, Daniel Carter was about to discover that the most meaningful chapter of his life had been waiting for him all along. The final chapter, Part 8, A Legacy That Lives On, brings the story to a heartfelt conclusion, showing how Daniel's kindness continues to inspire future generations long after he hangs up his uniform. For YouTuber retention, it's better to use Part 9 as bonus content after the ending, an epilogue or reflection rather than continuing the plot. Before you sleep, the Army officer who gave up everything for his men. Part 9, Epilogue, The Echo of Kindness. If you've stayed with this story until now, then perhaps you've noticed something. This was never simply the story of an Army officer. It was the story of choices. Quiet choices. The kind that rarely make headlines. The kind that are often forgotten by the world, yet remembered forever by the people whose lives they touch. Many years passed after Colonel Daniel Carter retired. Ashbrook remained a peaceful little town where neighbors still greeted one another by name. Children still rode bicycles down quiet streets, and every autumn the old oak trees covered the sidewalks with blankets of golden leaves. Visitors occasionally recognized Daniel. Some remembered his years of service. Others knew him only as the kind man who volunteered at the library, repaired broken fences for elderly neighbors, or quietly delivered groceries to families going through difficult times. He never corrected anyone. He had long ago stopped caring how people remembered him. He only hoped they remembered kindness. Every Friday morning, Daniel followed the same routine. He woke before sunrise. He brewed fresh coffee. He sat on the front porch while the birds welcomed another day. Emily often joined him with her own warm cup. Neither felt the need to fill every silence with conversation. Years of marriage had taught them that peace could be shared without words. Sometimes Daniel watched the first rays of sunlight stretch across the fields and thought about the many mornings he had spent far from home. He remembered young soldiers laughing over breakfast. He remembered long days helping communities recover after storms. He remembered mentors who had patiently guided him, and he silently thanked each of them. One spring afternoon, a small boy knocked on Daniel's front door. He could not have been older than 10. He held a battered bicycle with a broken chain. "Mr. Carter?" Daniel smiled. "Looks like you've got a problem." The boy nodded shyly. "My dad said you know how to fix almost anything." Daniel laughed. "I learned from someone much smarter than me." Together they rolled the bicycle into the workshop that had once belonged to Daniel's father. For nearly an hour they worked side by side. Daniel explained every step. He didn't repair the bicycle alone. He taught the boy how to do it. When the chain finally slipped smoothly into place, the boy's face lit up with pride. "I fixed it," Daniel smiled. "You certainly did." As the boy rode happily down the road, Daniel quietly whispered, "Thank you, Dad," because he knew exactly where the lesson had begun. The seasons continued to change. Summer became autumn. Autumn became winter. Winter welcomed another spring. Time never hurried. It simply kept moving. Daniel learned to treasure ordinary days more than extraordinary ones. Family dinners, morning walks, helping neighbors, reading stories to his grandchildren, watching Noah become the kind of father Daniel had always hoped he would be. Life had slowed, but somehow it had become even richer. On Daniel's 85th birthday, friends and family gathered for a simple celebration. There were no grand decorations, no elaborate speeches, just laughter, good food, old photographs, and people who genuinely loved one another. During dessert, Noah stood and quietly raised a glass. "My father once told me that people won't remember every word you say. They'll remember how you made them feel. I've spent my whole life watching him prove that." The room fell silent, not because anyone had been asked to, but because every person there knew those words were true. Daniel looked around the table. His grandchildren, his son, Emily, old friends, new neighbors. He realized that this was the greatest reward life could offer. Not recognition, not applause, simply being surrounded by people who had become family through years of love and kindness. Late that evening, after everyone had gone home, Daniel stepped outside one last time before bed. The stars shimmered quietly above Ashbrook. The same stars he had admired as a young cadet. The same stars that had watched over him through every chapter of his life. Emily joined him on the porch. "What are you thinking about?" Daniel smiled. "I'm thinking about how beautiful ordinary life really is." She squeezed his hand gently. "So am I." Together they watched the night settle peacefully over the fields. No speeches. No dramatic moments. Only gratitude. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson of all. A meaningful life is rarely built through extraordinary events. It is built through ordinary mornings. Patient conversations. Promises kept. Hands extended to help someone in need. A smile offered to a stranger. a kind word spoken at just the right time. These are the quiet gifts that echo long after we are gone. So tonight, as you close your eyes and let sleep gently find you, remember this. You do not have to change the whole world in a single day. You only have to make one person's day a little brighter. Because kindness has a remarkable way of traveling farther than we ever imagine. And somewhere, perhaps years from now, someone you have never met may be living a better life because of a small act of compassion you chose today. Sleep peacefully. And may tomorrow give you another chance to leave the world just a little kinder than you found it. Good night.